Thanks, Dr. Brummer, for helping to support my trip here. So I'd like to start just by telling you a little bit about who I am, what my different jobs are. It's kind of so you can know where I'm coming from, right? I think it's important to get somebody's perspective before they tell you all of the things that they want you to think about. So I'm an associate professor at a university that's not unlike this one. I teach lots and lots of undergrads and graduate students, mostly folks that are eager to go on and to do graduate training. And I have a really odd designation in my department of being the only person that takes what I call a contextualist perspective, or what you might have been introduced to as a behaviorist perspective. What I hope to do today is to open your eyes to something a little bit different than probably the behaviorism you got in your first psych class. So, over the years in all of these different jobs, I've sort of cultivated, something beyond just that perspective, something beyond the basic knowledge that would comprise a behavioral view. And one of the things that shaped is that this is really an odd perspective. Right, so most of psychology tends to all kind of group together, and where they differ is in the basic terms that kind of comprise it, the findings, the kinds of research that they might do. But they all seem to share some same philosophical underpinnings, and behaviorism doesn't. Right? So a contextual perspective is the foundation that really defines how behaviorism is different from other areas of psychology. It's odd, that was the first thing that I noticed. The second thing that I noticed, though, is that for me, that perspective makes my world a lot more workable. Right? For me, that perspective really works. And so I'd like to share just a little bit about that perspective. Now, I don't have any illusions that you guys are going to all leave here as contextualists. But what I do hope is that you'll have a sense of what that perspective is, right? One that goes a little bit beyond just knowing what operant or respondent conditioning are. In fact, we're not going to use any of those words tonight. And second, that you'll have a little bit of practice at picking up that perspective. As it's been workable for me, I would hope that there might be some contexts in which it would be workable for you. So the first thing I'd like to notice together is that humans are really interested in humans. Like, we are incredibly self-interested, right? We're really, really into talking about ourselves, talking about the things that we do, talking about other people. We love to learn and think about what people do. We watch reality television. We scroll Facebook just to see what's up in people's lives. Right? We post motivational memes to get people moving. We read self-help books and give them to other people. We love to learn and to think about what other people do. And we love to tell stories about why it is that they do it. I want to ask you to just take a moment to think about the conversations that you had today. And when I say take a moment to think about, like, I really mean that I want you to do that. To take a moment and think about the conversations that you had today. I want you to think about how many of those conversations were about human behavior. Right? Like all behavior. Like something that people thought, or people felt, or people did. When I say behavior, I mean all of that stuff. Stuff we can see from the outside and stuff we can't. So how many of them involve describing what you or someone else did and why they did it? How many of them involve something that somebody did when you really wanted them to do something else? How many of them involve something that was a surprising situation that you're trying to figure out how to handle? Right? How many of them were about something you're thinking about doing, or worried about doing, or planning to do? How many of them were you sharing what you're thinking or feeling, right there at that moment? So I want you to pause and just turn to the person next to you right now. What proportion of conversations that you had today do you think were about people, about human behavior? What do you think? I'm noticing that even right now, people are talking about people. All right, so for most of us, that number is going to be upwards of 60%, right? There is some data. The 60% mark, the reason reason why I said upwards is that for most of us, 60% of our conversations are actually about our behavior, right? So most of us also talk about other people. And this isn't surprising, right? Like we humans, we long for connection. It's the thing that motivates all of us, almost universally, outside of things that we actually can kind of see clearly that we need for survival. So after food and water and shelter, what we need is other folks. We don't have big fangs or big claws or lots of fur, so we kind of have to huddle together, right? We got to communicate, we got to cooperate in order to survive. I mean, it's the way that humans have sort of got on, is our ability to connect with others. And so we observe one another. Right? We search for groups that we might be able to belong with, that we might be able to connect with, places where we can thrive. And when that connection falters or is frustrating, when we're fearful of it, that's when we start asking ourselves why. That's when we start telling stories about how people act and why they act that way. And for most of us, we don't want that just to stay as storytelling. You know, for most of us, what we want is we want those stories to actually have some impact. We talk about why people do the things that we do because most of the time we want them to do something specific. Right? There's some behavior change that we want to occur. Pause for a moment, right? And think about those conversations you ran through. How many of them were you wishing for some behavior change? Right? For most of us, whether it's our own behavior or somebody else's, right? That was what it was about. We were talking about why someone was doing something because there was a particular thing that we wanted them to do instead. So we don't just like to tell stories about humans. We don't just like to tell stories about behavior. We like to influence it. And we want the stories that we tell to give us a way forward in doing so. I want you to take a moment and consider the things that you've done today. Like all of the activities from the time that you woke up to the decision that you're actually going to walk through that door, you know, maybe what choice you made as far as where to sit, whether to run to the bathroom first, wishing you had brought your water, right? Anything that you did today, inside and out, remember all of those are behaviors. How many of them did you do with the intention of impacting someone's behavior? Right? Even if it's a tiny little impact. How many of those were about influencing someone? For most of us, right, I would suggest that almost everything we do, either directly or indirectly, serves to make an impact on other people. The big things, the things that we spend tons of time on, right, like work stuff, family stuff, either directly or indirectly, volunteer jobs, hobbies, all of that. Most of what we do is about influencing behavior. Even the little things we do. Like even tiny things that you might do when no one is looking. Like earlier, I broke my glasses, so I put on some mascara. Because I don't really have eyebrows and it looks funny. Like, is that about my experience? Like, no. It's about things that you might think or feel, right? Ways that you might act in my presence. If you look at me and I look funny without eyebrows. Right? Even those tiny things that we do when we're all by ourselves are often about influencing people, right? Getting a particular kind of attention, preventing an unwanted interaction, making a particular impression. In fact, we are so interested in others, in behavior, in our own behavior, that we have whole disciplines, right? Multiple disciplines. We call them the behavioral sciences. They're about asking those questions about why, right, in a very particular way. Like in a systematic way, the way that we call science. You can spend a lot of time and a lot of money learning to engage in this process of inquiry about human behavior in this very specific way by studying sociology, anthropology, or if you want to study how to impact the behavior of humans around you, psychology. My understanding is that a good bit of y'all in here today have spent some resources to do exactly that. And you know, let's face it, I mean, even if your interest is more casual, you can always look up a TED Talk, you know, you're just a Google search away from how to influence people or how to make people think that you don't care what they think, you know, or a motivational poster on somebody's Facebook wall, you know, a parenting book about how to manage your child's ADHD. We are invested in this question. And so we live in a world where for any one instance of behavior where we might ask why, there are innumerable answers. Right? I would suggest to y'all that even in this relatively chill situation, that if we started picking out behavior and sort of peeled it out from everything that's going on right now and asked everybody in here to describe that behavior and say why it happened, that we'd get as many different answers as we had answerers, right? And actually, I'd purport that those answers would probably tell you more about the person doing the answering than about the behavior itself, but that's another story. Turns out even the folks that have spent lots of time and money to become experts in these areas, that we would even all have different stories. Right? Like we could take one simple behavior, like somebody, rubbing their shoulders or typing on their computer or stepping out to answer a phone call. And we could ask 10 psychologists, 10 of your professors, what just happened? Why did they do what they did? And they'd have 10 different stories. All of those stories grounded in data, grounded in sound theory, right? All of them seeing the world in a slightly different way. And again, here too, that story they told would tell you more about that professor's learning history, right? The places they've been, the path they've journeyed to now, than about the actual behavior. And so we have lots and lots and lots of words about human behavior. And we string them together into lots and lots and lots of stories about human behavior, all with the hope that those stories might guide us to some way of knowing, how to be, how to do things to make our lives and the lives of people around us better. We invest as taxpayers in our country. We invest in folks that are supposed to be experts in this stuff, folks who do this for a living, ask themselves why, and write these complex stories, hoping that their stories might lead the way. But I would ask you, do they? Do the stories that we tell about why folks do the things they do they buy us a better life? Do they buy us a better world in which to live that life? I want you to take a moment and ask yourself, just if one or two of those stories that you told today, one or two of those conversations, and ask yourself about the impact of that story. Either in your out loud voice or your inside voice, if you consider the stories you told today, the explanations you gave for why someone's behaving the way that they're behaving, which one of those stories got you closer to the impact you want to have in the world? Which one of those stories shined a light on something that you've never noticed was there, or opened you up to a new way to move forward? Take a moment and just consider that. And maybe the contrary. Which one of those stories closed a door and allowed you to turn away and walk away from the situation? Now, if this feels like kind of an odd question that I'm asking you to evaluate your stories here, evaluate these conversations, these explanations, then you're not alone. This is typically not how we handle stories. It's just not. Right? We typically treat our stories about everything, but here we're talking about stories about people, about behavior. We typically treat these stories as if they were mirrors, right? Mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Now, we know they're not perfect mirrors. Even folks that aren't psychology majors, they know that there's some bias, some things that we miss. You can almost imagine a warped mirror, right? So we know that we can never really access the world directly. We're sort of looking through the lens of this mirror, right? You can almost imagine us trying to hammer in a nail and get the angle of the mirror just right, knowing that it's not going to perfectly represent it. It's not going to perfectly reflect it. But our hope is that as we acquire knowledge over the course of our lives, or if we're scientists, over the course of our careers, our programs of research, our hope is that those mirrors get better and better and better, right? So that we can more effectively work on the world. Because remember, that's why we tell stories, so we can impact. So most of us think of our stories as mirrors. Right? And if any of the conversations that you had today were about explaining behavior, if 60 or 70 or 80% of them were about explaining behavior, your behavior or the behavior of others, then you might ask yourself, you might have asked yourself in the conversation, like, does that explanation fit? Does it cover all the different things that I've learned about this situation? Does it make sense? Does it reflect the world? Does it reflect my experience? Right? This is how most of us treat language. So most of us treat stories. Some most of us especially treat stories about people. But I'm going to ask you for a moment to do something really different with your stories. This is going to feel kind of weird. I'm going to ask you to consider your stories, right? Your stories about others or yourselves a little differently. I'm asking you to evaluate them as if they were not mirrors that you're looking in to do a job, but hammers. Like, we would never, upon trying to evaluate if it was a good hammer, we would never say, does it reflect the nail? It would make no sense, right? You wouldn't want a hammer that was just like a nail. You'd want a hammer that could do the job, right? What would really matter about the hammer is whether or not it was good at getting the nail in. So what if we evaluated our stories about behavior in that same way? What if we evaluated our stories about behavior in terms of how they achieve or don't achieve whatever goals it is that we're interested in? Those goals that keep us paying attention to behavior in the first place. We'd still have to admit we can't always see perfectly, But no, it's not about peering into the story to see if it reflects anything. Even with our eyes closed, do you suppose we could tell if the nail is going in? So do you suppose we could tell if the hammer's making contact? Do you suppose we could feel the point at which the job was done? It wouldn't be. If we're the experiences we acquire then, over time, the knowledge that we gain from our different experiences, they wouldn't be about gaining a more accurate reflection of the world as it is. It would be about getting better at holding hammers. Getting better at kind of looking at your own stories and going, does this work? Does it achieve what I want it to achieve? Does it open up space for me to move forward in the ways that I want to? So if any of the conversations you had today were about human behavior, especially explaining behavior that you might not be happy with behavior that you'd like to change, I'm inviting you to ask yourself, right now, to really ask yourself, not if it gave an accurate reflection, does it fit with how I'm feeling? Does it fit with this memory or that? But instead, what the impact of that explanation is. Right? See if you can't feel a difference in how these questions orient you. I'm going to suggest that they orient us in a very particular way. See, different ways of evaluating stories actually tend to pull for different kinds of stories. When we're looking for explanations to reflect what it is that we experience, we tend to tell stories that put the causes inside the human. We label, if I tell you someone didn't show up for a commitment today because they're irresponsible. And when you think about it, there have been lots of behaviors that you would consider to be irresponsible. You might accept that as true. You might ask yourself, why is she late? Well, it must be because she's irresponsible. We diagnose, I'm a clinical psychologist, right? So if a client exhibits a collection of symptoms consistent, they fit perfectly with a diagnosis of panic disorder, I might decide that's a true enough story. Why is he struggling with episodes of intense, uncued anxiety that seriously disrupt his life? Oh, because he's got panic disorder. We mind read, right? If a friend seems to always second guess her decisions and need extra encouragement, I might guess that she lacks confidence. Why does she struggle to make her decisions alone? Because she thinks she's incapable and she's afraid to fail. And we evaluate. If I read about an acquaintance that was involved in a physical altercation with his partner, I might assume he's a bad guy. Why is he being charged with domestic violence? Because he's violent and dangerous. And if we're interested in actually changing any of these behaviors that we're trying to explain, this kind of explanation, the kind of explanation that puts the cause right inside the person. These kind of explanations actually give us permission to just stop thinking about it, right? There's something inside them that I can't directly get at. Feels like, for a lot of us, especially if we're not in the business of behavior change for a living, it kind of feels like job done. But when we need a story that we can wield like a tool, when we need a story that actually has action implications for how we might interact with this human, how we might change the world to improve their behavior in the way we want, we're actually compelled to look outside of the person, at the things that we can see and move directly. Instead of labeling the person, we find ourselves hoping for ways that we could grow them. Instead of diagnosing the problem, we look out to the world, right, for how it came to be, how the world shaped it. And instead of mind reading, we wonder about the experiences that we could give the person. Instead of evaluating, we evaluate the ways the world is falling short of growing them. This is the approach that a contextualist perspective takes. It suggests that when trying to understand and influence behavior, that we can split the world into just two kinds of stuff: the behavior that we're interested in and the context, and the relationship between them. So what do I mean by behavior? I gave you a hint earlier. I mean everything an organism does. Everything. Thinking, feeling, breathing, remembering, right? Digesting, brain activity is behavior. I really like to think about behavior like a behavioral stream. Like at any one moment, you're engaging in an infinite number of behaviors. Infinite only because we could chop it up in tons of different ways. You're sitting, you're breathing, you're thinking, you're puzzling, right? You're wondering, you're ignoring, you're texting. Who knows, right? It's behavioral stream, and all of those behaviors, just like an actual stream, are almost like currents, like impacting one another, related to one another. Moment-to-moment way, right? And at any one moment, we could sort of peel out a single behavior. And, if we wanted to get closer to how this was really occurring, it would be better to think of it in that dynamic way, as a stream. So the first step in a contextual analysis of behavior would be to peel out just one behavior we want to understand. And remember, we're treating these stories like hammers. So how would we pick from the infinite number of behaviors in the behavioral stream? We'd pick a behavior that we'd peel out that would work, that fits our analysis. If we can't see it directly, if we can't measure it in a good way, right, depending on our goals, right, that's how we would decide what to pick. And once we've got behavior, we turn to the context. And we see the same sort of thing here, right? An infinite number of things that could potentially be context, right? And I say could potentially because it's only context for a particular behavior. It's only context in as much as it affects that behavior. But take a moment and notice, even now, just like there's an infinite number of things that you're doing in any one moment, right? There's everything you see. We could slice that up a bunch of ways. There's everything you hear. We could slice that up a bunch of ways. There's everything you feel in your body. That could be sliced up a bunch of ways, right? Literally an infinite number of events that we could call context. Of course, not everything happening in any one moment is impacting the behavior. Same thing here. We'd look for something that's reliably impacting the behavior, right? And we probably look for something that we could directly manipulate. Because again, right, it's not about knowing everything that could impact it. It's about hammers, right? The one thing that could actually have an impact. Or the group of things that could actually have an impact. So we're going to pick things that are directly related, and we're going to pick things that we can manipulate ourselves. Right? The second step in a contextualist analysis of behavior would be to directly observe the context that maintain the behavior and the conditions under which that behavior occurs. And so, once we've got a behavior that we want to understand and change, any one of those behaviors that you thought of enough to talk about to someone today, one of your own behaviors or someone else in your life. Right, once we've got a behavior that we want to understand and change, and some context that we're guessing might matter, then we start to know a little bit about function. Because all we mean by function is the relationship between context and behavior. Right? If I say the function of a context, or here's a hint, by context, all I mean is the stimulus, same thing, right? So the function of a context is just the behavior that occurs in its presence. And the function of a behavior, or a response, is just the conditions under which that behavior occurs. So simply by defining the behavior and the context that impact it, we have established a functional relationship between context and behavior. And so in this way, right, as we move about the world, contexts become meaningful. The acquisition and transforming of functions in an ongoing, dynamic way is what we call learning, and we're always doing it, right? In other words, we're learning in every moment of every day, and if we slice out just one of those moments, then we can assume that every single behavior that we're engaging in is the perfect behavior. The perfect behavior for that immediate context and considering the historical context, all of the learning that's taken place to make the context function like it does now, in this moment. And if we think about the mechanisms of learning, the mechanisms of acquisitions or transformations of function, we know a couple of things about this. We know that behaviors strengthen when they change the world in ways that people would work for. We know that when two contexts sort of come together in spatio-temporal proximity, right, they rub up against each other in time and space, that they come to have the same functions. They come to impact behavior in much the same way. I want you to take a moment and notice what this means for you. As you thought about the conversations that you had and you thought about the things that you do, I want to ask you to think about the interactions that you had. I want to ask you to think about them with a particular attention to what you might be teaching the people around you. Take a moment to consider every interaction you had today in terms of what you were teaching people. You as a context for their behavior. You as a person with particular functions, right, engaging in that process that is the everyday moment-to-moment learning. And consider for a moment what they were teaching you as a behaving organism, them being a context for your behavior, them having particular functions. Note that all of our personological explanations, all of those explanations that put causes for behavior inside the person, they all collapse context and behavior into one descriptive term: irresponsible, panic disorder, confident or not, dangerous. Each of these imply a particular behavior in a particular situation. But if the whole point of telling stories is to impact behavior, then the problem with these kind of stories is that they don't have any direct action implications. They don't tell us what to do. Like, once we've peeled context out, all we're left with is behavior, and once we've peeled behavior out, all we're left with context is context. But if the two are together, then where are we in the analysis? If I want to impact you, and the way that I'm describing your behavior doesn't include me, then how do I know what to do? Again, if you're not interested in impacting behavior, this might not matter much. But if you're a teacher, or a mentor, or a clinician, or a parent, it might make a difference, right? What if, when we asked why, we were asking, how did the world create this perfect behavior? And how might we add to the world to create the perfect context for the best behavior to emerge? How would you navigate your life differently if you just assumed that everyone's behavior is exactly right for where they've been and for where they are now, and that everyone is capable of extraordinary growth, including you? And how would your life be different if folks had assumed that about you? I want you to take a moment to consider the context where this could really matter. Somebody on the internet said that there are these top 10 concerns of college students. I'm guessing that you guys fit in the millennials category. So I figured I would check this out and Google it, and I put all the lists together. It's very scientific. And I want you to consider this. So even if you don't agree on the kinds of behaviors that would need to change, right, how many of these things that folks tend to be concerned about currently have to do with behavior change? How about things like climate change, or large-scale conflicts like wars, or general inequality and equal access? How about things like poverty or religious conflict, government corruption, a lack of security of food and water, lack of education, safety, right? Lack of opportunity? Like each of these things, again, whether or not we agree on the kind of behavior change that would be involved, like how many of these, right, fixing them, if we were concerned about them, how many of them would involve needing to change some behavior? And if we stop and ask ourselves, like, what needs to happen to create that behavior change, we could likely stop and see how challenging a contextual perspective actually is. Like, there's a good reason that we only see it in behaviorism. As we might find ourselves suggesting, where folks are just too selfish, or too stupid, or too whatever, to make the changes that clearly seem to us need to be done. And what about you? Like, what are the things that you care about enough in your world to talk about, to worry over? Things that would actually be worth taking this contextual perspective on. Actually be worth taking responsibility for changing your behavior to create a new context and new learning for folks around you. For me, what shows up is stuff like parenting. I have 3 children. My daughter Hannah is 19. She's up in college in Ohio. I have 2 12-year-old boys, and like each of them needs something very different from me as a parent, right? Like Jackson, I was talking about earlier, Jackson is like my hunter, my sports guy. He likes to be outside running. He much prefers chores like mowing the lawn. Julio's into video games and D&D and reading and making music. Like what they need from me to grow and to thrive and to learn about the world is completely different from what the other one needs. And the 19-year-old is just a whole different business, right? Or what about, like, I'm a therapist. Right? If when somebody walks into my office and says, here are my symptoms, and I say, here is your disorder, like that doesn't tell me what to actually do with them. It's like if somebody came to me and said, why do I have this bread and meat and cheese and lettuce and mayo in my hands? And I said, because it's a sandwich. Okay, right? And if that sandwich is causing me great distress, does that explanation buy me anything? No? If I'm going to greet the folks that walk into my office, right, brave enough to carry their suffering through the door, committed enough to sign up for psychotherapy, which is no picnic for either of us, like I owe it to them to have an explanation that includes me. An analysis that includes how I might change their behavior to teach them new things, right? That directly includes me. Not just an assumed, like they lack this skill, so maybe I just need to tell them about it. Like I need an analysis that includes that looks at it directly. Or how about mentoring? Like I have a large lab, 5 or 6 undergrads, another 12 or so graduate students. And like when I first started as a professor, I thought that the way to be a good mentor was to give them all exactly the same thing. That was a terrible mistake. Right? They all had completely different learning histories. They all had completely different ways that thriving was going to look on them. So I needed an analysis that split apart any labels that I might have about them, like maybe they're irresponsible or maybe they're lacking confidence. I had to split that apart into what's the behavior that I'm actually seeing and how might I change my behavior to create a context to grow them. I'm going to ask you to consider just one bit of behavior change that could be really meaningful in your life. Like the kind of thing that you might say, like, I just wish they would blank. Right? Like maybe it's a professor, maybe it's a parent, like sometimes you want to shake your parents and be like, be better. maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's your roommate, and maybe it's your partner, maybe it's yourself. Right? I want to ask you to just try on these questions. What is the behavior I hope for them? And what is it that they do instead? Am I willing and able to participate in growing their repertoire? And if I am, if I'm going to take this on, like this particular way of loving this person, what is it that I value here? And if not, how can I minimize their impact in my life? What makes the hoped for behavior hard for them? And how does that problem behavior they're engaging in really serve them? How about this one? What kind of world must have grown them in this way? And what kind of world must they live in currently where this behavior actually works? Are there contexts in which I've seen them engage in behavior that's closer to what I would want, what I'd hope for? And how could I bring those contexts here? And then finally, what kinds of things am I willing and able to offer that they would actually work for? If you are familiar with the analyses that are involved in operant and respondent conditioning, right? If you are familiar with behavior analysis, then you should recognize this, right, as just a contextualist perspective. So when we ask questions like this, the main thing I'd like you to walk away with is that we have the opportunity, if we can resist the urge to tell stories that end with causes inside the person, and instead tell stories that point to causes outside of the person. If we can be bold in the role that we're willing to take, and not just telling those stories, but in actually growing people's behavior around us, right? That we could use these stories as a way forward. And in doing so, I think we foster increased opportunities for what we're all willing to work for, and that's human connection.